Good morning, everyone. We will be starting shortly.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first day of the CLA Rural Powerhouse Week. This is a week-long programme of digital events designed to explore some of the opportunities and challenges we face as a sector. And this replaces what would normally be our big annual conference in the QE2 Centre in London, which for obvious reasons we're not doing, but we're doing this, what I think will be a tremendous week of online events. Many of you will be familiar with the CLA Rural Powerhouse campaign, which we've been running for the last year, highlighting the opportunities in the rural economy and what, with the right policies, the growth that can be unlocked. Today's theme is all about a future without BPS. What's the future direction of UK agriculture and land management after we leave the EU? And clearly this is very timely, as we're only 5 weeks away before the start of that transition. The format of today's session is I will have a discussion with the Secretary of State for about 30 minutes, and we'll then turn to you, the audience, for a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at any point during the session. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen, and please don't use the chat bar because we won't be following the questions on there. And for anyone who's wanting to follow on using social media, can you use the hashtag RPW2020? So I'm delighted to welcome George Eustice, our Secretary of State for DEFRA. He's been in this role since February, and prior to that was Minister of Agriculture for many years, serving under no less than 5 Secretaries of State since joining the DEFRA team back in 2013. He comes from a farming family in Cornwall, where he started his career, and his family run a very successful diversified farming business there. He's been the MP for Camborne and Redruth since 2010. Welcome, Secretary of State.
Good morning.
Perhaps we could start off our discussion talking a little bit about vision. We're at a key point for the sector as we leave the EU and we look to the future with great opportunities. And really just to explore some of your thoughts about what that vision looks like and where you see the future of agriculture. Perhaps if we could just start off, you've been in the department for a number of years, but how do you feel your personal vision is for the sector? How has it evolved, and is it in any way different to your predecessor, Michael Gove, who sort of started this process 2 or 3 years ago?
Well, Mark, as you said, I've been in the department for some time now, in fact, since the end of 2013. And as some of your members will recall, I was one of those who campaigned to leave the European Union. And in fact, way back in 2016, in a speech during that campaign, I set out the key tenets of future agriculture policy once we left. And in my role as farming minister, under a number of Secretaries of State, starting with Andrea Leadsom initially, then Michael Gove, and then Teresa Villiers as well. I've been working on that plan for that future policy, setting out an approach where we would essentially depart from area-based subsidy payments. I don't think an area-based subsidy makes much sense. I personally think it was probably a mistake to go for area-based payments in the first place. I think if we had our time again 20 years ago, it would have made more sense to start to introduce more environmental conditionality around the subsidies there that we had, and to gradually phase those out rather than do a sort of revolutionary switch to area-based payments. And so where we want to get to is a system where we've got a vibrant, profitable farming industry that gets a fair share of the value in the supply chain for the food that it produces, that is supported by government to reduce its costs and invest in new technology so that it can become more profitable, where the difference between the best performers in a given sector and the worst performers is much narrower, where we create new opportunities for new entrants to get access to land and to bring fresh thinking to the industry across a wide range of sectors. And also, obviously, where we fulfill our ambitions to get land use change in some areas so that we can meet our ambitions to plant more woodland and create more forestry so that we can deliver our commitments on climate change. So this is a great opportunity for our country. It is a period of great change that will cause undoubtedly apprehension among some, but the government policy going forward won't be a top-down rule book as we all got used to on various iterations of the Common Agricultural Policy. We want this to be a policy that will support the choices that individual farm enterprises might make.
Okay, well, thank you. So just sticking on vision for a little bit, there's much debate within the industry about whether we should be going down what people refer to as a land sharing or a land sparing. And for those that aren't familiar with that, land sharing is where we do farming, the environment, and everything in an integrated way on an individual farm. And land sparing is about producing as efficiently as and intensively as we can on one area and doing biodiversity and wildlife on another. What, from a vision point of view, is your view as to whether we go down those very, very different routes?
I don't think you need to choose one or other of those routes. In fact, I think the future probably entails a combination of both. And the reason we've constructed our future environmental land management policy to have three components is that you need to have one component, a tier if you like, that is accessible to all, that is universal to all farmers, and that supports things like sustainable farming, improved soil health, catchment sensitive farming to improve water quality, sensitive management of hedgerows and boundaries, and integrated pest management. We will never deliver our environmental ambitions unless we have a component like that that is very much about incentivizing and supporting farmers in farming sustainably. But equally, we will never meet our commitments and our ambitions on climate change unless we see a significant increase in woodland and unless we are planting more woodland. And we've got an ambition to be planting 30,000 hectares of woodland by the end of this Parliament each and every year. Now that is a big commitment. And to do both of those things, we need to see sustainable intensification on some of our lands, on some of our soils and arable soils. And we need to support farmers, both to invest in the technology, but also to adopt the agronomic techniques that make that intensification sustainable. And we need to embrace technologies such as gene editing to make sure that we can make a reality of that. And we need to support structural change and support new entrants onto the land. And then we will, in some areas, it will make sense where this is a choice that the landowner wants to make. It will make sense to incentivize some landowners in some landscapes to plant woodland and to opt for landscape change. So I think we need to do both of those things to fulfill our environmental ambitions. but also to ensure that we are still producing food for the nation and have a successful, profitable farming industry.
Okay, thank you. You talk about producing food for the nation. If you roll forward 20 years, I mean, if we take the premise that roughly we produce about 60% of the food we consume in this country, because obviously there's lots of things that we can't produce in this country which are imported, and then there's some sectors where actually we produce more than we consume, but in total it's about 60%. Where do you see that number being in 20 years' time? Do you think that we as a country will produce more of our own food, about the same amount or less?
I think my personal view on this is it's unhelpful, and people do this, to take the sort of production to supply ratio and to look at that as a measure of food security. My personal view is that we should target the right thing. And if you target making farming profitable so that it's attractive for new entrants to come in and to rent land and produce food, where farmers get a fairer share of the supply chain, if you do those things and it's profitable, then you will see probably your self-sufficiency measure rise over time. But I think if I can give a comparison, it's a little bit like in the 1970s when they had high inflation. Initially, governments of all sorts of colors tried to have an incomes and prices policy, and they tried to set regulatory policies to fix prices and to fix incomes. And it was a total failure. And what they realized in the end is that they just had to target money supply, and then things would come back into balance. And so I think you have to target the right thing to get the right outcome. And the right thing to target is farm profitability.
Okay, thank you. Well, perhaps we could move on to the sort of core element of the future plans, the ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and talk a little bit about that. We CLA did a recent survey that we carried out on the membership, which was carried out in partnership with Stratton Parker, which showed a real enthusiasm for ELMS, driven by a concern about climate change and the ecological crisis we face. However, those same members do have concerns about the future scheme and how it will actually work in practice. And a lot of that is around the sort of scars and experiences of previous schemes, whether it's IT systems, whether it's payments, and payments not just the payment rates, but also the sort of when payments have come through and you sign a contract and it doesn't come through. How can you reassure us, or can you just give us your view of how this is and why this is going to be different and better this time?
Well, yes, and to answer this, we have to acknowledge the chronic weaknesses of the EU system that we have been under. Many of the problems that we had with the IT systems in this latest incarnation of CAP, but also earlier ones, stem from the extraordinary problems that you have with EU auditors and with EU regulations. And so the EU started to require that we map every field for BPS to 4 decimal places. That caused huge problems. We need to introduce a new system to do it. We needed to remap all of the fields around the country, and that threw up horrendous problems and caused all sorts of difficulties, both for the administrators, but also for farmers as well, who had delays to their payments. It's also the case that with those Pillar 2 agri-environment schemes, you used to be able to enroll on them any month of the year. That staggered the work across the year. There wasn't a common commencement date. The IACS inspection regime didn't apply to Pillar 2 schemes in the old days. The EU changed that in the last incarnation of the scheme. They required by law that there should be a common commencement date, that everybody had to start at the same day, and they introduced the IACS inspection regime. Those two things together were a cocktail for disaster and caused all sorts of problems with the administration of those schemes. Now, it's important to note that the UK government opposed both of those measures. We argued fiercely against a common commencement date and against the imposition of IACS, but we were ignored and the EU simply imposed that. But now that EU law will be gone, It will be for the UK government to decide what works and what makes sense. This is a great opportunity for us in terms of the administration of these schemes. So the end state, if you like, for the environmental land management scheme is one where it's less about obsessive mapping and fretting about this or that ineligible feature, but much more a vision where you'd have a trusted agronomist accredited by the government to support farmers in putting together a covenant on their farm, if you like, an agreement on their farm that's tailored and designed for their farm. And to actually walk the farm with the farmer and work out what would or wouldn't work, sit down around the kitchen table and put together a plan for that farm and an agreement for that farmer. So we can bring back that human interaction, human judgment, human contact, if you like, between a trusted agronomist who knows a particular geography and the farmer who knows his fields. And that can be, I think, a huge breath of fresh air compared to the sort of chronic bureaucracy that we've all had to suffer in recent decades.
Great, thank you. I think certainly that varying start date just on its own will make a huge difference to people and changing how the payments work. You mentioned the trusted agronomist. Do you see that as a private sector delivered model or a combination of it being delivered alongside Natural England or other agencies? Or yet to be decided?
We're open to a hybrid model at the moment, but broadly the concept that we are developing behind the sort of the end state environmental land management, if you like, is that you would have a field force of private agronomists. These might be people that are trusted by the farmer, or indeed they might be people that are linked to third sector organizations like the wildlife trusts, who already do some very good work in the farmed landscape. And these people would become accredited and trained by the government to help administer the schemes. And they would then visit the farm, walk the farm with the farmer. They might, an individual might have, say, between 50 and 80 clients. And they would help those farmers put together an agreement that worked for their land. And I think you then get to somewhere much more sensible, which is rather than having all of the form filling that we've had to date, and then if something goes wrong, having to call a helpline and be held in the queue for hours because you can't get through to anyone. When you do get through to someone, they don't know anything about your farm, or indeed perhaps the schemes that you're trying to claim and access. Instead, you might have an agronomist that you know, you've got their mobile number. If you've got a question, you can just ring them. And this starts to become a far more sensible way to implement schemes like this. Of course, we'd have to have some kind of oversight as well. So I do envisage a management function for the RPA to, if you like, police and check those accreditors. So someone needs to check the checkers, as it were. But I think we can get to a much more sensible place in terms of the way we administer these schemes in future.
Thank you. So turning to the sort of how we get from where we are today to the sunny uplands that you paint, the transition. So in 5 weeks' time, roughly, the transition starts the beginning of 21, and it's set to, our BPS is set to be reduced over that 7-year period. And obviously, as a CLA, we fully endorse this move to public money for public goods, and we've been talking about it for 10 years, and we think it potentially can be a really world-leading scheme that combines sustainability with environmental recovery. But as we move, the ELMS will not be fully ready for another 4 years, and the government is coming forward with this new concept of a sustainable farming incentive. There's been talk about, but not well understood yet. Can you just talk a little bit about how that will help bridge from where we are today to when ELMS is fully available, and reassure our members, farmers, landowners, that we're not going to go into some sort of chasm and cliff edge over the next few years, which is clearly a concern for many people with it starting so soon?
Well, we very much want the transition period to be what it says, a transition period, not a lull or a hiatus or a period where nothing happens, culminating in a sort of overnight revolution with a new IT system dumped on people and a total change. And so the important thing, in my view, is that this 7-year period should be viewed as an evolution from the legacy scheme we have now to the scheme we want to get to. And that means that we're going to actually try and roll out components that will eventually be part of the environmental land management scheme early. So we envisage that in 2022 and 2023, we will make some further reductions in the basic payment scheme, and we will also simultaneously roll out components that will become part of the environmental land management. So there will be a prototype, if you like, of what we've previously called the Tier 1 scheme, which will be the sustainable farming incentive. And that will be open to all farmers, and it will support them around the way they manage their hedgerows or on issues like soil health, water quality, integrated pest management. It will all be about holistic whole farm approaches to delivering sustainable agriculture. We will also, during that period, be de-bureaucratizing the legacy countryside stewardship schemes, but expanding the amount of money made available into those. And we believe that an expanded countryside stewardship scheme can then be, if you like, a stepping stone to what we previously called Tier 3 of ELM. And we will also, during that period, be having certain projects to support woodland planting, peatland restoration, and other nature-led restoration projects for those landowners that are interested in that, which will be a sort of prototype version of what would then become the third tier. So I think it's very important that we see this as a journey and as an evolution, not a revolution. And that means that as we gradually reduce the basic payment scheme, we must simultaneously give farmers options that they can access to make up the income that they've lost through BPS, but also to start to acclimatize themselves to the new schemes going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that the department DEFRA are also looking in this transition period at support for productivity to try and boost productivity. Obviously, there's been a number of small schemes available in the last few years, and that I believe is going to be, and I know is going to be, looked at, and there'll be more of that. What do you see that as a short to medium term thing, or do you see that as long term? That sort of productivity, those grants, and just briefly, what do you see it targeting? Is it anything within agriculture, or do you believe it needs to target certain specific criteria?
Well, look, the agriculture bill had a very clear clause that gave the government the power to support spending to improve productivity and enhance profitability. That wasn't a clause that was linked to the transition period. That is a clause that is there in the bill in perpetuity. And the view of this government is that supporting and enhancing farm profitability is going to be incredibly important. Supporting science and innovation is incredibly important. Our plan is to continue to do that, and that is what the bill provides for. And I think it's always important with these things that people don't start thinking what might happen in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. But by that time, I probably won't be in this post anymore. There might be a different Secretary of State who has a different view about the balance they want to take. But the view of this government is that we will be supporting productivity, supporting investments that enhance research and development and plant breeding, and we don't put any time limit on that spending at all.
Okay, thank you. Could we turn to the current EU negotiations? And obviously you can't tell us anything that's not in the public domain, but really just to pick up some of the concerns. And if I just quote from your predecessor, Michael Gove, back in February last year when he was DEFRA Secretary of State, let no one be in any doubt how difficult and damaging a no-deal Brexit would be for the farming sector. Clearly, you're more than well aware of the concerns. How would DEFRA step in if we don't get what we want? to sort of support the sectors that will inevitably face a short-term crisis? And the second part of the question is, I read in the Farmers Weekly your editorial about how you would want to boost exports, for example, in lamb. Can you just give us some how you believe government can help drive those exports? So it's sort of short-term problem, if we don't get what we want, which of course we all hope we will, and the longer-term fix. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the the first thing to say is, look, our preference is that we get that zero tariff agreement. It's something the UK has always asked for. We're not asking actually for anything special really from the EU. We're saying we accept your premise that if we're not in the single market, there'll be all sorts of paperwork required. Let's just go for a zero agreement on tariffs and have a simple off-the-shelf free trade agreement, a bit like they have with Canada. So it's the European Union that are being particularly difficult and not even offering something they've already concluded with other countries like Canada. But however, if there isn't a free trade agreement, we have had to start to think about what that means for certain sectors. And through that process, something quite interesting has emerged, and that is that, yes, there would be sectors affected, those in particular where we are net exporters. So the sheep sector in particular would be affected, although the peak export months tend to be from June to October, and September's the peak month, so it wouldn't bite, if you like, until later next year. Barley may also be affected because we're a net exporter there. But if you look at a full range of all the other sectors, whether that's pigs or poultry or dairy or beef, other arable, fresh produce, in most other areas, because we're a net importer, actually the imposition of tariffs really is a case of the EU cutting off their nose to spite their face, because their producers do start to get affected. You do start to see import substitution taking effect, where there are new opportunities for UK production in those areas, where in the short term you see a firming, not a dramatic, but a firming in farm gate prices for some sectors in agriculture. And so it will be swings and roundabouts, I think, is the answer in the event of no negotiated outcome. The sector that we are looking quite closely at is the sheep sector. We've previously worked up interventions that we might make based around a ewe headage payment or a slaughterhouse premium, and obviously we would monitor the situation closely. But we would also have to recognise that in that short-term period, sterling is a floating exchange rate against the euro that may adjust and may take some of the edge off any impacts of tariffs for the sheep sector. And it's also the case that if the price of beef went up and the price of lamb went down, you would get changes in consumer behavior with people buying a bit less beef and a bit less lamb, and that might help to iron things out. So there would be a number of automatic stabilizers that would have an impact in this space. And we'd have to judge at the time, what the appropriate intervention would be. Now, then you have to think about the medium term. And I think really, if it's the case that there's never to be a free trade agreement with the European Union, well, then we would do two things as a country. First of all, we would pursue other markets, and there are opportunities in the United States for lamb. It's a growing market, particularly younger consumers in the US are eating lamb in a way they've previously not in previous generations. And we would also look at other markets in the Middle East and Asia as well to offset any loss of demand from the European Union. And the second thing that we'd have to do is frankly pursue a policy of import substitution. And because the UK is the third largest import market in the world after China and Japan, rather uniquely in the European Union, we are the only country that has the ability, should we wish to pursue a strategy of import substitution to support our domestic producers to step up and produce the food that previously producers in Denmark or Ireland or France were producing.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I have two final questions, and then give an opportunity for those watching to put some of their questions. One is around sort of strategic planning of where we do what on our land. And I guess as Secretary of State for DEFRA, all of these different things, whether it's feed into you. So the government has multiple objectives. we want sustainable food production, as we've talked about earlier. We need to get to net zero, and there's a very ambitious government strategy around tree planting. We've got the 25-year environment plan and nature's recovery, flood mitigation, and then of course, huge house building and infrastructure. Boris's build, build, build. So some of the research I've seen suggests that we almost don't have enough land to do all these different things that we're wanting to do in this country. So who decides the priorities of what happens where? Do you see it as a top-down, this is the best place for this and this is the best place for that comes from a strategic plan from government? Or is it up to you and me on our farms to decide what we want to do bottom up?
The thing to remember is you can't get anything done on any of these fronts unless you've got the landowners and those who rent land on board with the plan and working with you on it. So it can't be a top-down plan. It has to be a system where government, yes, has got its policy objectives, and where it then has a coherent suite of policies that support landowners and land managers to take the choices they want to make. And in some areas of the country, in some landscapes, and for some landowners, that will be very much redoubling their efforts on sustainable intensification, reducing their costs, improving their profitability. And in some areas, and for some landowners, that may entail them taking a judgment call that actually they should go into forestry, or they should put their land over to woodland creation and be much more ambitious about what they do for the environment. So it will be a combination of land use change and sustainable intensification. And that is why you need the full panoply of government interventions to support those choices. We will, within the new policy as well, have a theme in some of the policies that will encourage and support groups of landowners that want to come together. Some of the pilots that we've been running, the trial work we've been doing, has been looking at how you can incentivize farmers and landowners to come together within a geography and to collaborate so that they can really deliver wildlife corridors, for instance, and some of that work's been successful. But again, that won't be for everyone. Some landowners will very much want to be captains of their own ship and do their own thing. Others will be more open to work together. And the role for government is to support the choices that they make.
Great, thank you. So final brief question, and then I will turn it open, and that's really around science. And you touched on science in some of your opening remarks. But I just really wanted to see how we can ensure that how you believe we can ensure that UK agriculture really leads in technology and science, which we clearly have a fantastic opportunity to do in this country after we leave the EU. We saw in the debate on the Ag Bill, the House of Lords really pushing hard on this point about gene editing, and I believe the government have said they will take away and look at that, and the Prime Minister's also talked about it. Could you just talk about where you see the real opportunities and how quickly we can embrace them?
Yes, so a couple of things I would say. When we publish our policy paper on the agricultural transition period, we are setting out some more detail about what we envisage by way of research and development. My belief is that really in recent decades, we've had successful things such as the agri-tech strategy, but generally the problem has been that R&D in agriculture has been money that gets doled out to universities, and then universities and academic institutions will corral a few farmers to take part in a few trials. And where it tends to fall down is getting the transfer of any output from that research onto individual farms, the so-called knowledge transfer. And I think the only way to change that is to reverse the way that things are done. We should be giving grant support to farming businesses, agri-businesses, to come together to tackle a common challenge. It might be a plant breeding program to deal with a particular fungal disease. It might be perfecting new agronomic techniques to deal with a particular pest on carrots, for instance. We should be able to give grant support to joint ventures or farm businesses to come together. And then those businesses and their agronomists should commission the universities to work for them. So So we need to get to a position where universities work for commercial enterprises, not where universities have the money and invite commercial enterprises to get involved. And I think if you do that, then you'll have greater direction, more commercial focus on the type of R&D that's done. So we are looking at this idea of R&D syndicates where we would support businesses to come together in such ways and be able to gain access to government funding. And then they can go out there and commission whichever academics they think have got something to offer and hold those academics to account to deliver what's been asked of them. The second area is in legal reform. There was slightly odd judgments of the European Court of Justice a couple of years ago that deemed that gene editing, which is a form of cisgenesis, should be treated in the same way as GM for the purposes of regulation. The UK government disagreed with that at the time. We made that clear to the court at the time. And now, of course, we are free of EU law. We will be consulting on how to modernize the law in this country and strike down the consequences of that ECJ judgment.
Okay. That's been excellent. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I'm now going to turn and thank you for everyone who put their questions on, and please do add them and I will get through as many as we can. We can do some rapid fire Q&A if that's all right, Secretary of State. So the first question is from, and there's been a number about BPS inevitably, and I know the government is going to be coming forward with an announcement in the next soon. So this is from Abby Kay, and the question is, it's about the devolved administrations. And Fergus Ewing told Agri-Scott last week that he was personally committed to maintaining some kind of direct payment for farmers in future. Now, for those that don't know, Fergus Ewing is Minister in Scotland, the Scottish Government. Are you concerned about the impact this could have on the UK internal market, with English farmers expected to lose half their BPS by 2024? And I suppose alongside that, we've got Wales, who are also on a different trajectory, somewhere between where we're going to be starting in 21, and I believe Wales is reviewing it, but possibly starting their transition in 22. So it's the question about that internal market and BPS.
Well, I think we have to recognise that agriculture policy is devolved. And so just as now Scotland and Wales will design slightly different Pillar 2 agri-environment schemes to those which we have in England, so too as we depart from the EU, yes, it's open to them to do things differently. Of course, the Scottish government's taken the view that it is going to have continuity and largely continue to do whatever the EU does on most fronts. Whether they will stick to that over the long term when the EU starts doing things or continues to do things that don't make a lot of sense will remain to be seen. But in terms of whether that has a big distorting effect on the market, our estimate today is it probably doesn't. And there's a sort of fallacy really, which is that the Common Agricultural Policy delivered a level playing field. It did nothing of the sort. Farmers in the Netherlands, based on an area-based payment, already get about 3 times more subsidy than farmers in England do. Farmers in Poland get a fraction of the area payment than farmers in England do. So throughout the European Union, despite this policy that was allegedly about level playing field, there was no level playing field. There were huge distortions all over the place. And I actually think that what you need to do as you have this moment of freedom, if you like, a period when you can throw the shackles off, take the blinkers off, and actually start to think coherently about what a modern 21st century policy for agriculture looks like. You should not be shackled to the sort of bureaucratic quagmire that we've had with the Common Agricultural Policy. You should pursue good policies that enable our farmers to become more profitable, enable them to add value to their produce, and enable them as well to deliver for the environment. And crucially, the new the new environmental land management scheme that we are introducing will go beyond income foregone. We are clear about this, the quid pro quo, if you like, for removing those sort of old style area payments and saying that we want people to take up environmental land management is that you've got to be able to reward them for it, not just compensate them for their loss for doing a good turn for the environment as the EU schemes require. And therefore, I think we can get the balance right. And we're not going to be distracted by what Scotland may or may not do. We will be pursuing a policy that delivers profitable agriculture in England.
Okay, thank you. Question now about the Agricultural Act and interventions from Ian Ashbridge. Can the Secretary of State comment on the inclusion of provisions within the Act for direct interventions? Sorry, am I getting so many coming in? I must know. Direct interventions in agricultural markets. Is this in anticipation that without direct payment, government will need to intervene to prevent business failure? How likely does government consider this, and under what circumstances would the Secretary of State be prepared to act? Thank you.
It's a very broad power, and it is there, principally to replace something that we had under the EU system. So there is, as people will know, something called the crisis reserve in the EU budget. They top slice the basic payment scheme and put money in a crisis reserve each year. And if there is a severe market disturbance, as for instance, we saw with dairy markets previously, there's an option for them to be able to have some kind of crisis scheme to help farmers with that. So it's not really in anticipation of a crisis. Let's hope there isn't one, but it's very much simply replacing powers that existed in EU law, and of course powers that existed prior to us joining the EU. The reality is that agriculture, and I know this from direct experience, is a risky business. There are risks of market disturbances in commodity markets. There are weather risks, and there are risks of animal and plant health disease as well. You need to have intervention powers at your disposal to help deal with those crisis situations. And those powers are to replace powers that had been previously in EU law.
Thank you. Questions are coming from all different angles, so I'm just going to be picking out some themes. This question is from Simon Dixon Smith. Some would argue that sustainable intensification is going to require more mixed farming. Access to livestock, local livestock markets, slaughterhouses and retailers will be important. Will the government commit to supporting the supply chain beyond the farm gate?
Well, we will look at that, and I think it's an interesting point. In fact, if you were to look at some of the things we seek to achieve with the sustainable farming incentive, it would be probably to encourage more emphasis on soil health, and therefore more emphasis on types of crop rotation, possibly in some of our arable lowlands, encouraging periods where there is a grass lay with leguminous nitrogen fixing crops and with particular flowering plants within that grass mix that are good for pollinators and so forth, and that maybe start to replicate some of the traditional features of a meadow to help build back our ecosystems in some of these landscapes. And that probably does entail financial incentives that would actually drive something more akin to a mixed farming approach. It won't necessarily mean that an individual enterprise will become a mixed farm again. I can see a scenario where you will have land swap agreements between a local sheep farmer who enters a land swap agreement with certain arable farms and vice versa. So I can see different types of arrangements on joint ventures to manage areas of land through land sharing agreements. But certainly if you want something to be more sustainable, I think getting back to that, some of those agronomic principles around mixed farming will probably be important, and we will be incentivizing them. Now, if at the end of that, we need to also look at pump priming local infrastructure to support the return of livestock to some of those lowland areas, well, obviously we can look at that at the time, but I would hope that the market and the arrival of a new market for those areas might be sufficient to drive that kind of infrastructure.
Thank you. Just turning to some of the stuff we talked about, particularly around countryside stewardship. So countryside stewardship is available now for us all to apply to. There's a number of questions. There's one particular one from Annie Brown asking about this. Is you mentioned about rolling start dates. Come January, come next year, or do you hope that that sort of idea of rolling start dates can start to be introduced into countryside stewardship as well as ELMS, or is it more just for the future of ELMS? Because it would be a huge help for people who come out of their current schemes in January and have to wait 11 months before they can get into a new scheme. And tied to that is a similar question, which I've lost here, so many coming in, which is about what we termed the Go guarantee, which was that if you go into countryside stewardship, we, the government, promise you won't be disadvantaged when ELMS comes along, because there is that nervousness. And now we've got SFI that's going to start in 22. Can you give people some reassurance that are thinking about stewardship now that they're not, A, start dates, and B, that they're not going to be excluded from SFI or ELMS? Thank you.
Yeah, I think on the first point, we do have the power now, should we want to start to change those start dates again and enable people to start on any month. We've stopped short of doing that for next year, for the simple reason we had enormous problems, as those in these schemes will know, as a consequence of the complexity of them. We now have got those back on an even keel, and the RPA have gone for a single payment date, and they've got things back on track. And what I didn't want to do to the RPA is, having just got to the point that they've made one system finally work and had got people their money on time, to suddenly chop and change and cause another bout of uncertainty. But certainly when we come to the future environmental land management scheme, it's absolutely the case that I would like to move away from the sort of common commencement date. I would like people to be able to enroll at a time that suits them. This idea that we have at the moment, that the busiest time of the year in May, everyone has to race around trying to do their BPS application, is, to my mind, absolutely bonkers. In future, I'd like to get to a time when people can pick the month when actually maybe it suits their enterprise, when it's a bit quieter, when they can put these types of schemes together, and then kind of roll from one year to the next, adjust them as and when they see fit, but not to have this sort of chaotic annual application that's a feature of the EU system. So there's a great opportunity to do things differently in the new scheme. Now, on your second point, we're absolutely committed to this. I want countryside stewardship to be seen by those farmers who envisage perhaps doing work along the sort of second tier, if you like, of environmental land management, to see countryside stewardship as a stepping stone to that. So what we will do is expand the budget on countryside stewardship, in particular, probably during 2022 and 2023. We want to drive up participation rates, currently sitting at around 40%. I'd like to get that much higher. And then what we will do is, from 2024 onwards, give people the opportunity to consolidate both their sustainable farming incentive, plus their countryside stewardship, plus anything they might be doing by way of woodland creation, to effectively go through a consolidation process where those schemes are simply converted into an environmental land management scheme. And therefore, between 2024 and 2027, we'll have a gradual migration of people from those stepping stone schemes, if you like, into the end state environmental land management scheme. And we won't necessarily rush people to do that, but we will migrate people in turn as they want to into those new schemes, and there will be definitely no financial loss to them for doing so. In fact, there may even be a financial incentive for them to go through that conversion consolidation process once we get to the full rollout of environmental land management.
Thank you. Just changing tack slightly here. This is around rural development and all the RDPE funding that the industry has benefited from, and as many on this call will know, those European signs on the side of farm shops and whatever it might be, or businesses. The question is from David Hughes. What plans have the government for replacing the successful rural development programs that have supported farms and rural businesses via EU funds since the 1990s? They're particularly crucial to support businesses to support growth and development within the rural economy, translating to the creation of jobs.
So the thing that I'd say is the farm productivity grants that we currently have under Pillar 2 of the CAP are going to be administered directly by DEFRA, aimed at improving farm productivity. Some of that will support big projects. That could indeed be for something like a farm shop, or it could be for a piece of equipment and a piece of new technology on the farm. But what's previously been the sort of the leader schemes under the agri-environment scheme, the current proposal is that those would become part of the Shared Prosperity Fund, since we think that's probably the logical place for it to sit, because it's much more around rural businesses and sometimes community projects in rural communities, and less about agriculture per se. So the current plan is that will form part of the Shared Prosperity Fund. And I think, we will a little bit later this year be giving a bit more detail about how the Shared Prosperity Fund will work and how that will reflect some of those rural needs as well.
Okay, thank you. Question here from Victoria Vivian from your part of the world. In areas like West Cornwall, we're often making dual claims. FBT tenants take BPS and land managers make HLS claims and delivers to it. If this arrangement is ending, how does the Secretary of State think it's best placed to make the Tier 1 claims? And this is particularly around where you've got short cropping on land, as I understand it, down in Cornwall, often with whether it's flowers or vegetables. Thank you.
So we are looking quite closely at this. Obviously, Victoria is a part of the world I'm very familiar with. Indeed, most of the sort of brassica and daffodil production is in my particular constituency. And there are some quite interesting ideas that have been around, including put forward by Tregothnan Estates, I know, but also some of the larger agri-businesses down there like Riviera Produce. I've been talking to them about this. And one idea that we're interested in piloting is whether some of those agri-businesses who will typically rent land for a couple of years and then move on, and maybe a potato grower will follow a brassica grower, or a daffodil grower will come in and then it may return to grass and so on. We want to look at whether some of those businesses could come together in a joint venture and effectively have longer tenure of the land, but have an investment in it. So it's not just going in a sort of bandit fashion and taking what they can out of the land and then moving on in a nomadic way. They actually work together as groups of enterprises to show custodianship of the soil and the land between them through their joint venture, access the environmental land management scheme to support that endeavour, but also get the rotation they need while not detracting from their own individual specialisation. So we're looking at some of these quite creative models where you could have joint venture tenure of land and both the joint venture company and potentially the landowner as well, either be part of that joint venture or indeed have agreements that they perform themselves. But I think if you could get on some of this land where there's quite a tendency for short-term lengths, if you could get to a position where there was a joint venture company that accessed environmental land management, that engaged a range of tenants who'd have a land sharing agreement between them, and the landowners, you start to get to a really interesting model.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. Probably one more question, and I'll just draw out from two different people. And one is George Browning. Are there actually any plans to make natural methods that avoid artificial inputs more attractive to farmers? And linked to that, question from Rupert Wells Fairburn about does the government have a view about increasing organics? And I suppose this is in a context where the EU, interestingly, in their scheme, they're looking to really increase that as part of their sustainable farming. How does the government view that, or is it part of that sustainable farming picture? Thank you.
Well, it comes back to what I said at the very beginning, which is this government, now free of the EU with a future policy, is not going to pursue a top-down rule book type approach where we dictate to farmers, this is what we want you to do now. We want to support farmers in the choices that they make. And so, yes, we will have schemes to support farmers who want to convert to organic and to provide maintenance payments for those that do so. There are other interesting projects that have been around, such as the sort of nature-led recovery at NEP, for instance, which I know one or two landowners have shown interest in. That won't be right for most farmers, but for some, they might want to take that route, small numbers maybe, but for those that do, we would want to be able to support them in that endeavor. And equally, for those who want sustainable intensification and to be producing food profitably, we stand ready to be supporting that choice as well. So yes, we see a role for organics. We will have a scheme to support it, but we won't be dictating whether farmers should do it or not. The job of government, in my view, is to set up the right system of incentives, the right policy framework so that we can support the choices of individual enterprises.
Secretary of State, thank you very, very much indeed. It's been really comprehensive. That hour has gone very fast, and I apologise, or it certainly has for me. I apologise for all of those who have asked questions that I haven't got to, because there have been a lot, and we've got a huge number of participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just also like to thank our sponsors, Strutt & Parker, who are overall sponsors for the series, and today's sponsors, Oakbank, Game and Conservation Trust. And all of you should have received this morning an email around 9 o'clock setting out the material for today, the theme of the move away from BPS. And within that, you'll see a very good interview with, particularly for Welsh members, an excellent interview with Leslie Griffith, the Welsh Environment Minister. This afternoon, there's a link to the Preparing Your Businesses for a Future Without BPS, talking to specialists and members about that. There's a podcast about the ELMS test and trial, about how CLA members are involved in a number of those. And there are various blogs and videos from other members who are preparing for a future, and also from DEFRA's Future Farming team. Then tomorrow we've got, the theme is international trade. I'll be talking to the Trade Minister, Greg Hands, at 1 o'clock. And once again, each morning, there'll be a number of things, if you're registered for that day, that you'll receive. Wednesday, it's climate change and the road to net zero. We have Dieter Helm in the morning at 10 o'clock, and an example estate who's really leading in this thinking from Hokum in the afternoon. And finally, on Thursday, navigating the planning system. There's an interview with the Housing Minister. We'll be talking about the government's planning changes and tips for CLA members from CLA experts and also other members about the planning system. So I hope you will continue to stay engaged over the course of this week. Get stuck in, lots to read about and see. And thank you very much for taking part in this discussion with the Secretary of State. And thank you.